My name is Marsden Oakes. I'm 35 years old, I fix scales for a living, and at my own birthday dinner, my grandmother leaned across the table and asked me if the college fund had covered everything. All $200,000 of it. I put my fork down and said the only honest thing I had. What fund? I took out loans for everything, and then I watched two women I had eaten 1,000 meals with turn the color of candle wax. Welcome back to Cheating Tales Lab, where we take the worst night of somebody's life apart, the way you'd take apart an engine, slowly, with the parts laid out where you can see them. Stay with me on this one, because what I learned in the 11 months after that dinner is something almost nobody gets told. If somebody ever set money aside for you, you are legally allowed to ask for the receipts, in writing, and the people who steal from families almost never steal in one big grab. They steal the way a bad scale lies, a little at a time, in a direction nobody thinks to check. I measure things for a living, so let me show you what happens when a man who measures things finally decides to measure his own life. Marsden Oakes had spent his entire adult life in a trade most people don't know exists. He calibrated scales, not bathroom scales. The scales that decide what a farmer gets paid for 11 tons of corn. The scales under a gravel truck at the county pit. The little balances in a pharmacy that measure out doses in tenths of a gram. Twice a year he loaded a set of stainless steel test weights into the back of a white van, drove out to a grain elevator or a scrapyard or a dairy, and told people whether the thing they trusted was telling them the truth. He had learned the trade from his grandfather. Tilden Oakes had opened Oakes Scale and Weight in 1961 in a narrow brick building on Vernon Street in Sparrow Bend, Indiana, with a hand-painted sign and a floor that sloped 1/8 of an inch toward the alley. Tilden used to say the same thing to every apprentice he ever had, and he said it to his grandson maybe 400 times before he died. A scale doesn't lie to hurt you. It lies because nobody checked it. That's it. That's the whole crime. Marsden was 7 when he learned what a standard was. His grandfather took him to the state metrology lab in Indianapolis, past 2 sets of doors and into a room where the temperature never moved, and showed him a cylinder of polished metal sitting under a glass bell like a jewel. That's a kilogram, Tilden said. Not a kilogram of something. The kilogram. Everything else in this state gets compared back to that. And Marsden, who was 7, asked the only question that mattered. What if it's wrong? Then everything is wrong, his grandfather said. And nobody would know for years. Tilden died in 2006, in November, in a chair by the window with a crossword folded on his knee. The shop closed the following spring because Marsden was 17 and his grandmother was 65, and nobody in between was left to run it. His father had died in a truck accident when Marsden was 4. His mother had lasted 2 more years in Sparrow Bend, and then moved to Arizona with a man named Rick, and sent birthday cards for a while, and then didn't. Which left Lucille. Lucille Oakes had taught high school chemistry in Sparrow Bend for 31 years. She was the kind of teacher whose former students still crossed a parking lot to say hello to her at 70, 80, 84 years old. She kept her checkbook balanced to the penny. She kept a garden that embarrassed the neighbors. She had raised her grandson from the age of 11 in a 2-bedroom house on Larkspur Street, with a kitchen table that had a scorch mark on it from a chemistry demonstration that had gone better than expected. And in the spring of 2007, 4 months after her husband died, Lucille Oakes sold the shop building on Vernon Street to a man who wanted to put a bakery in it, took the check for $118,000, added $41,000 from Tilden's railroad pension death benefit and $11,000 of her own savings, and drove to an attorney's office on the square with the whole thing in a manila envelope. She was very specific about what she wanted. She did not want to give a 17-year-old boy a pile of money. She had watched what money did to the Hobart boys 2 streets over. She wanted the money locked in a trust, held by a bank, released only for tuition and books and rent and food, while the boy was actually enrolled somewhere, and whatever was left when he turned 30 was his, free and clear, to start something with. She wanted it professional. She wanted it boring. She did not want it sitting in her own account where she might be tempted to spend it on a roof or a hip. The attorney sent her to the trust department at Petersham Savings and Trust, a 2-branch bank on the square that had been in Sparrow Bend since 1904. And the trust department at Petersham Savings and Trust, in the spring of 2007, was one woman with a corner office, a green desk lamp, and an excellent reputation. Her name was Delilah Strayhorn. Lucille liked her immediately. Delilah Strayhorn had a way of writing down what you said and then reading it back to you, which is a very small thing that makes people feel like they exist. She explained the fee schedule twice. She said the words fiduciary duty in a way that made them sound like a promise instead of a legal term. She said, "Mrs. Oakes, from today forward, I am legally required to put that boy's interests ahead of my own." And Lucille, who had been a widow for 4 months and was tired in a way she could not describe, said thank you and signed the instrument on the 11th of April, 2007. The trust was funded with $170,000. Over the next 13 years, invested conservatively in exactly the way Lucille had asked for, it grew to a little over $268,000. Marsden Oakes never saw 1 cent of it. He went to a state school an hour and 40 minutes north. He worked at a lumber yard in the summers and at the campus dining hall during the year, 4:30 in the morning shifts, and he graduated in 4 years with a degree in industrial technology and $112,000 in student loans in his own name. He got his metrology certification at 24. He bought the van at 26. He never once asked his grandmother for money because she was a retired school teacher living on a pension in a house that needed a roof, and because he had been raised by a man who thought asking for help before you had tried everything was a kind of theft. And Lucille never asked him about the money, because in her mind she had already handled it. She had signed the paper. The bank sent statements. The bank was a bank. She had done the responsible thing, the boring thing, the thing you do so that nobody ever has to have an awkward conversation about money at a dinner table. That is the entire mechanism of this story, and it took Marsden 11 months to understand it. The theft did not need a mastermind. It needed a gap. It needed one woman who assumed the money was being handled, and one man who never knew there was money, and a professional standing in the space between them with a green desk lamp and the legal authority to sign both their names. The gap held for 18 years. It closed on a Thursday in September, over a plate of pot roast, because an 84-year-old woman with a very good memory finally did the one thing nobody had ever done. She checked. Marsden's birthday fell on the 12th of September, and by that point, the birthday dinner was less a celebration than a treaty. It happened at the Strayhorn House on Sparrow Lake, because the Strayhorn House on Sparrow Lake had a dining room that seated 14 and a deck that looked out over water, and because Delilah Strayhorn had a way of hosting things that made it clear the hosting was not up for discussion. Marsden had married Katrina Strayhorn in the fall of 2015 in a tent on that same lawn, and for 10 years he had been the quiet man at the end of that table. He liked his wife's brother, mostly. He had learned the rhythm of the family the way you learn the rhythm of a machine that makes a noise you can't fix. Delilah ran the conversation. Amory told the same 4 stories. Katrina refilled glasses and steered. And Marsden, who spent his working life in rooms where nobody talked, ate his food and answered when he was asked something. He had noticed things over the years. Of course he had. He was a man who noticed a scale reading 2/10 high on a Tuesday. He had noticed that his mail came to a post office box and that Katrina had set it up in 2015 because, she said, the mail carrier on their street had lost a package once. He had noticed that his wife did the taxes, all of them, and had them prepared by a CPA named Dashiell Fournier, who had been her mother's accountant since before Marsden existed. He had noticed that his wife did the taxes, filing separately, just to see the numbers. Katrina had laughed and then had not laughed for 2 days. He had noticed that his mother-in-law, who had retired from Petersham Savings and Trust in 2016 at 54 years old, owned a house on the lake worth $600,000, and that no one in the family had ever explained how. He had a theory about that, actually, and the theory was the most ordinary theory in the world. He assumed there was old family money somewhere. Every town has 3 or 4 families where the money simply predates you. He had never dug at it, because digging at your wife's family's money is the behavior of a man looking for a reason to be angry, and Marsden Oakes did not want a reason to be angry. He wanted a Sunday where nobody performed anything. So he sat at the end of the table on the 12th of September, with a plate of pot roast and a glass of the good wine that came out when Lucille was invited, and he watched his grandmother, 84 years old, in the blue cardigan with the pearl buttons, ask a question that she had been meaning to ask for about 6 years. Lucille had been having a small, quiet worry for a while. She had stopped getting statements at some point. She thought it was around the time they went digital, and she had never been able to work the website, and she had asked her grandson about it once at Christmas, and he had said something non-committal because he had genuinely thought she was talking about her own accounts. But she was 84, and 84 is the age at which women who taught chemistry for 31 years stop being polite about loose ends. She waited until the plates were mostly cleared. She put her hand on Marsden's forearm, and she leaned in the way you lean when you're trying to keep a question between two people, and she said it. "Sweetheart, did the college fund cover everything? All $200,000? Marsden heard it. He heard every word of it. He also heard the sound of his wife's fork touching her plate and stopping there. He said, "What fund?" And then, because his grandmother was looking at him with an expression he did not recognize, he said the rest of it. "Gran, I took out loans. For everything. I'm still paying them." The room did something that Marsden would spend the next 11 months trying to describe accurately, because he was a man who cared about accurate descriptions. It did not go silent. Amory kept chewing. The dishwasher kept running. What happened was smaller and much worse than silence. Lucille Oakes turned her head, slowly, and looked at Katrina. Then she looked past Katrina, at Delilah, at the head of the table, and both of them went white. Not pale, not embarrassed. White. The specific bloodless white of a person whose body has understood something several seconds before their face has been given permission to. Katrina's hand was flat on the tablecloth. Delilah Strayhorn, who had hosted this dinner every September for a decade, who had never in Marsden's memory been at a loss for the next sentence, sat with her mouth very slightly open and said absolutely nothing for 4 full seconds. 4 seconds is a long time at a dinner table. Marsden counted them. He counted them the way he counted the settling time on a load cell, because that is what his brain did under stress, and he would later think that this was the single luckiest thing about the way he was built. Then Katrina laughed. It was a good laugh. It was warm and slightly indulgent, and it came with a hand reaching over to squeeze Lucille's wrist, and she said, "Oh, Gran, that was the savings bond thing, remember? That was years ago." And she stood up and started stacking plates, and she said something about pie, and Delilah's color came back into her face all at once like a light being switched on, and Delilah said, "Lucille, you have the memory of a woman half your age and it's terrifying to all of us." And everybody laughed, and Amory said something about the Colts. And Marsden Oakes sat at the end of the table with his hands flat on his thighs and understood, with a calm that frightened him a little, that he had just watched 2 people execute a maneuver they had practiced. Not planned, practiced. There is a difference, and he knew it the way a mechanic knows the difference, between a new noise and an old one. A planned lie has edges. A practiced lie has a groove worn in it. His wife had reached for that savings bond sentence the way you reach for a light switch in your own hallway in the dark. He did not say anything else. That was the first decision, and everything that came after it grew out of that decision like a tree out of a seed. He ate a piece of pie he did not want. He complimented the crust. He talked to Amory about a tent job in Kokomo. He carried the recycling out to the bin at the side of the house, and he stood in the dark for 90 seconds with his hand on the cold plastic lid and let himself feel the thing all the way through, one time, so that it would not come out sideways later. Then he went back inside and asked his grandmother if she wanted a ride home. In the van, on the way back into town, with the heater ticking and the streetlights going over the windshield in that slow rhythm, Lucille Oakes told him everything she remembered. And her memory, as her daughter-in-law's family had just noted, was terrifying. She remembered the date, the 11th of April, 2007. She remembered the attorney's office on the square, the one with the green awning. She remembered that the trust instrument was 11 pages, and that she had read all 11, because she had taught for 31 years, and she did not sign things she had not read. She remembered the amount, $170,000, and she remembered exactly where each piece of it came from, down to the $11,000 out of her own savings account at Sparrow Bend Federal. She remembered that the trustee was Petersham Savings and Trust, and she remembered the woman. She remembered the green desk lamp and the way the woman wrote things down and read them back. She remembered being told that the boy's interests came ahead of everyone else's, legally, forever. She did not remember, for about half a mile of dark road, why that woman's face kept sliding around in her head. Then she said, in a voice that had gone very small, "Marsden, pull over." He pulled over on the shoulder past the Caseys and put the flashers on, and his grandmother sat with her purse in her lap and her hands folded on top of it and said the sentence that started everything. The woman at the bank was Delilah. Marsden did not react. He would think about that a lot later, the fact that he did not react. He put his hand on the gear shift and looked at the dashboard, at the fuel gauge and the temperature gauge, and the little green odometer, and he said, "Are you certain? I introduced you to her," Lucille said, "at the Founders' Day thing. 19 or 20 years ago. I said, 'This is the woman who's minding your grandfather's money.' You were 17. You shook her hand. He had no memory of it whatsoever. He had been 17, 4 months after his grandfather died, and the entire year was a gray smear. But Delilah Strayhorn had that memory. Delilah Strayhorn had been standing at a Founders' Day booth shaking the hand of a 17-year-old boy whose trust account she had already been raiding for 11 months, and 6 years later, when that boy was 23, her daughter Katrina had bumped into him at a hardware store in Sparrow Bend and asked him, laughing, if he knew anything about replacing a shower valve. Marsden sat on the shoulder of County Road 9 with his flashers going for a full minute and a half. Then he said, "Gran, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it exactly. I need you to not call anybody, not Katrina, not the bank, not that lawyer, nobody." "Why?" she said, and he said the thing his grandfather used to say, and it came out of his mouth before he had decided to say it. "Because you never tell a machine you're about to test it." The first thing Marsden Oakes did the next morning was go to work. He drove 90 minutes to a co-op elevator outside Frankfurt and spent 5 hours calibrating a truck scale that had been reading 0.4% light since June. 0.4% does not sound like anything. On 100,000 bushels, it is a used car. He wrote the certificate, he stamped it, he shook the manager's hand, and he drove home with the test weights rattling gently behind him and a plan assembling itself in his head in a very particular shape. The shape was the shape of a calibration. You do not walk into a plant and announce that their scale is stealing from them. You do not accuse. You take an independent standard, something whose value you can trace all the way back to that cylinder under the glass bell in Indianapolis, and you put it on the platform, and you write down what the machine says. Then you do it again at a different load. Then a third time, in a different order, to catch hysteresis. And when you have 4 independent measurements that all say the same thing, you stop needing to argue with anybody, because you are no longer holding an opinion. You are holding a document. Marsden decided, on Interstate 65, somewhere south of Lebanon, that he was going to calibrate his own life, quietly, with traceable standards, and that he would not say a single word to a single member of that family until he had a certificate in his hand. He was very good at not saying words. It turned out to be the most useful skill he had. He started with things that could not be taken away from him. That was Rule 1, and it came straight out of the trade. Before you test anything, secure your standards, because a standard somebody else can adjust is not a standard. That night, while Katrina was at a spin class, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and pulled his own student loan servicing history. All of it. Every disbursement, every deferment, every payment, going back to the fall he turned 18. He downloaded it, and then he emailed the PDF to an address he had made that afternoon, and then he emailed it to his own work address, and then he put it on a flash drive and put the flash drive in the toolbox in the van, under the tray where the shunt resistors lived. The document was 41 pages. It said that Marsden Tilden Oakes had borrowed $112,400, and that as of that September, he still owed $63,000 of it, and that he had never missed a payment in 11 years. The second standard was his grandmother's paper. He drove to Larkspur Street on Saturday morning with 2 coffees and a box of donuts, and told her he wanted to look through Tilden's files, which was true. Lucille Oakes did not throw things away. In the second bedroom, in a green metal file cabinet that had come out of the shop on Vernon Street, in a folder labeled in his grandfather's block capitals, Marsden found the closing statement from the sale of the building, $118,000, dated the 2nd of March, 2007. Behind it, the railroad pension death benefit letter. Behind that, in his grandmother's handwriting, a page of arithmetic in pencil, where she had added the three numbers together and gotten 170,000, and circled it, and written the word fund next to it, and underlined it twice. And in the front of the folder, the thing he had not let himself hope for. A carbon copy, 11 pages. The Oakes Educational Trust, dated the 11th of April, 2007. Signed by Lucille M. Oakes, grantor, and countersigned on behalf of the corporate trustee, Petersham Savings and Trust, by an officer whose signature was a confident, forward-leaning loop that started with a D. He read all 11 pages at his grandmother's kitchen table while she made eggs. Page 4 told him the trustee shall provide an annual accounting to the grantor and, upon attaining majority, to the beneficiary. Page 7 told him the trust terminates on the beneficiary's 30th birthday, at which time the remaining corpus shall be distributed outright to the beneficiary. Marsden had turned 30 on the 12th of September 2020. 5 years ago, he had spent that birthday at a Mexican restaurant with 11 people and had paid for the meal himself and had gone home and gone to bed. He photographed every page with his phone. He photographed the pencil arithmetic. He photographed the closing statement. Then he asked his grandmother if she would let him take the whole folder, and she said of course, and he said no. Actually, Gran, I want you to keep it. I want you to put it back exactly where it was, and I want you to not mention it to anybody. And she looked at him for a second over the top of her glasses, in a way that made him feel 11 years old, and then she said, "You look like your grandfather when you get like this," and put the folder back. The third standard was the mail. Marsden had been getting his mail at a post office box for 10 years. Katrina had set it up. He had the key on his ring, and had used it maybe 15 times in a decade, because his wife stopped there twice a week, because she was already downtown, because it was easier. On Monday, on his lunch break, he went to the post office and asked for a copy of the box application. The clerk had to get a supervisor. The supervisor was a heavy-set man named Glenn, who wanted to know why, and Marsden said, "Honestly, because I want to know whose name is on my mail." Glenn looked at his driver's license and looked at the screen for a while and then turned the monitor slightly, which was more than he had to do, and Marsden read it. The box had been opened in March of 2015, 6 months before the wedding. 2 names were authorized to receive mail at it: Marsden T. Oakes and Katrina S. Strayhorn. That was normal. That was married people normal. The line under it was not normal. There was a forwarding instruction attached to the box, entered in 2016, that routed a specific category of mail, first class from a list of business senders, to a second address. The second address was a commercial mailbox in a strip mall in Kokomo, 40 minutes away, rented to an entity called Quion Administrative Services LLC. Marsden looked at that for a while. Then he said, "Thank you," and paid $11 for a printed copy, and went out and sat in the van in the post office parking lot, and did not turn the key for 4 or 5 minutes. Here is what he understood, sitting there. He had been imagining, since Thursday, something he could survive. He had been imagining a mother-in-law who had gotten into trouble in 2009, the way people did in 2009, and had borrowed from an account she was minding, meaning to put it back, and had never been able to. He had been building her an excuse without noticing he was doing it, because she was his wife's mother, and he had eaten Thanksgiving at her table 10 times. A woman who panics and borrows does not rent a mailbox in another county under a company name and install a mail forwarding rule that runs for 9 years. That is not panic. That is maintenance. The word landed on him like a weight on a platform, and the needle went where it went, and Marsden Oakes sat in a post office parking lot and revised his entire understanding of his own marriage in about 90 seconds. Because if the theft had needed maintenance for 18 years, then somebody had been maintaining it, and the maintenance was living in his house. He drove back to work. He calibrated 4 pharmacy balances that afternoon at a compounding pharmacy in Logansport, and his hands did not shake once, because his hands never shook. That was, in a strange way, the thing that would eventually beat them. They had all spent a decade around a man who did not raise his voice, and had concluded that he did not have one. That night, Katrina made chicken and asked him how his day was. And Marsden, who had made a decision on Interstate 65, smiled and said it was long, and asked about her sister-in-law's thing, and ate the chicken. He would keep that up for 7 months. If you have never tried to live in a house with somebody you are investigating, understand that it is not the lying that is hard. The lying is easy, because you say almost nothing, and almost nothing is what you were saying before. What is hard is the affection. She still put her hand on the back of his neck when she walked past his chair. She still fell asleep against his shoulder during movies. She still laughed at the specific way he said the word calibration, which she had been doing since 2013. He had to receive all of it, and keep his face right, and put it in a box, and then go out to the van at 11 at night to check a document. He got very thin that fall. Katrina noticed and made him go to a doctor. She sat in the waiting room with him and held his hand and was worried, genuinely worried. And Marsden sat there with his wife's hand in his and thought about a mailbox in Kokomo. The probing started about 10 days after the dinner. It was skillful. He had to give her that. She never asked him a direct question. She built openings and waited to see if he walked into them. She said, "On a Tuesday, God, your grandmother the other night. My mother was so upset. She feels awful. She thinks Gran's getting confused and she doesn't know how to bring it up with you." She said, "On a Sunday, did you ever have savings bonds, like from your grandpa? I feel like you told me that once." She said, "In the car, 3 weeks in, apropos of nothing. You know, if you ever wanted to look into the loan forgiveness stuff, Dash could look at it." He does that for people. Marsden gave her nothing. Not because he was clever, because he had genuinely nothing to give at that point, except a post office form, and because the trade had trained him to never state a result before the measurement was finished. But he made one mistake, and it was almost the whole thing. 4 weeks after the dinner, he asked his wife, lightly, over dishes, whether her mother still knew anybody at the old bank, because he wanted to ask somebody a question about a business account for the shop. Katrina said, without turning around, "Oh, that whole place got eaten by Meridian in 2016. Mom says the records are a nightmare. They lost half of it in the conversion. She wouldn't know who to even call anymore." It was a perfectly reasonable answer, and it was delivered to the sink, and it was also, Marsden noticed, an answer to a question he had not asked. He had asked whether she knew anybody. She had answered about the records. She had told him not to look for the records. He put the dish in the rack and said, "Huh," and dropped it. And that night, in the van, with a flashlight, he wrote in a spiral notebook the first line of what would eventually be 160 pages of notes. Subject knows records exist. Subject volunteered that records are unrecoverable. Unprompted. Then, underneath it, because he was his grandfather's grandson and could not help himself, he wrote the second line. Nobody volunteers that a scale is broken unless they've stood on it. Meridian Bancorp had bought Petersham Savings and Trust in the spring of 2016 and had closed the Square branch 14 months later. The building now held a physical therapy practice. Marsden went into the Meridian branch on the State Road in October, with his grandmother's carbon copy in a folder, and asked, politely, for the trust file. He was there for 2 hours. He was handed off 3 times. The final person was a young man named Trevor, with a nice tie, who did his best, and who eventually explained, with real regret, that legacy fiduciary records from the Petersham acquisition had been migrated in 2016, and that anything the trust department had held in paper had gone to an off-site vendor, and that the retention schedule for terminated accounts was 7 years, and that Marsden's account had terminated in 2020, and that, therefore, there was very likely nothing. He also said, because he was 26 and had not yet learned what not to say, "You'd have better luck finding one of the old Petersham people. Half of them are still around. They used to keep everything." Marsden asked him who. Trevor said, "Oh, I don't know. My mom used to bank there. Ask at Sparrow Bend Federal. Half the old tellers went over there when the branch closed." That afternoon, Marsden Oakes, 35 years old, walked into a small bank on the square with a box of donuts, which is a thing that works far better than people expect, and asked the woman at the desk if any of the old Petersham people worked there. She said, "Not here, honey, but you want Vesta." Vesta Kessinger was 74 years old and lived in a ranch house on Orchard Lane with a Buick in the driveway and a screened porch full of tomato plants in 5-gallon buckets. She had worked at Petersham Savings and Trust for 38 years, first as a teller, then as the records clerk, which meant that for the last 22 of those years, she was the person who knew where everything physically was. She let him in because he said his grandmother's name. "Lucille Oakes taught my daughter chemistry," she said. That woman is the reason Bonnie is a pharmacist. Sit down. You want iced tea? Sit down. Marsden sat on the screened porch for 3 hours. He did not tell her what he thought had happened. He told her what he knew, which was a much smaller and more careful thing. He told her his grandmother had funded a trust in 2007 and that he had turned 35 years ago and never received a distribution, and that he had never seen an accounting in his life, and that the bank on the state road had told him the file did not exist. Vesta Kessinger listened to all of it with her hands around a glass of tea and her feet flat on the floor. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Honey, they told you wrong." She said it twice more over the next 10 minutes, in different ways, and each time she said it, her jaw got a little harder. Because Vesta Kessinger had spent 38 years being the person who told other people where things were, and she had spent the 8 years since the branch closed watching a bank tell customers that things were gone, when what was actually true was that nobody at the new bank knew how to look. Then she told him about the reels. When the Square branch closed in 2017, the microfilm went on the truck to the vendor. All of it. Except that Petersham, being a bank founded in 1904 and run for most of its life by careful people, had made 3 copies of everything on film. One went to the vendor, one went to the fire vault in Indianapolis, and one, the working copy, lived on a rack in the records room in the basement of the Square branch, and had lived there for 30 years. And when the movers came in 2017, there was no line on the manifest for the working copies, and the man with the clipboard would not sign for anything that was not on the manifest. Vesta had asked him 3 times. He would not sign. So Vesta Kessinger, who was 66 years old and 2 weeks from retirement, had made 4 trips to her Buick with a hand truck and had put 11 cardboard cartons of microfilm in her garage, where they had sat for 8 years next to the Christmas decorations, because throwing away a bank's records struck her as the single most irresponsible thing a person could do, and because nobody had ever once called to ask for them. She looked at Marsden Oakes over her glass of iced tea. Trust Department was reels 12 through 19, she said. I know because I filed them. Vesta's grandson Rustin was 27 and ran a document scanning business out of a unit behind the tire shop on Route 22, digitizing medical charts and church records and, twice a year, the entire archive of the County Historical Society. He had a microfilm scanner that had cost him $9,000 used, and he had never once in 4 years had a job that made his hands sweat. They did it on 3 consecutive Sundays, with the door locked, because Marsden insisted on a chain of custody. He wrote down the time each carton was opened. He photographed each reel's label before it went on the machine. He had Vesta sign a 1-page statement, which he had written out longhand and which was almost certainly not in proper legal form, describing where the cartons had been for 8 years and who had touched them. Rustin thought this was hilarious for about 40 minutes, and then stopped thinking it was funny. Reel 14 contained the Oakes Educational Trust. The account had been opened on the 11th of April, 2007, with a deposit of $170,000. It had been administered, from day one, by D. Strayhorn, trust officer. The first 11 months were beautiful. There were quarterly statements. There was a modest allocation into a conservative fund. There was an annual accounting mailed to Lucille M. Oakes at Larkspur Street on the 20th of January, 2008. And Marsden made Rustin scan that page twice because he wanted his grandmother to see that she had been right, that she had done it correctly, that for 11 months the machine had worked exactly the way she had been promised it would work. The first disbursement request was dated the 9th of March, 2008, $12,400 for tuition and fees, fall semester, requested by the beneficiary. There was a form. There was a signature on the form, Marsden T. Oakes, in handwriting that was not remotely his, a school teacher's forward slanting cursive with a looped capital M. There was a second page authorizing payment to a third-party administrator rather than directly to the university, because, according to a typed note, the beneficiary is a minor and the grantor has requested administrative handling. He had been 17 years and 6 months old in March of 2008. He had not applied to a college yet. 61 more disbursement requests followed over the next 11 years. Marsden read every single one of them on a screen in a metal building behind a tire shop, while a space heater ticked in the corner. They got better as they went. That was the thing that made him get up and walk outside twice. In 2008, the forgeries were crude and the amounts were round. By 2012, there was a semester-by-semester schedule attached with realistic-sounding line items: room and board, lab fees, a study abroad program in Valencia that Marsden had never heard of and had certainly never attended. By 2015, there were receipts. Somebody had built receipts. Every payment went to the same place. Quion Administrative Services LLC, described in the file as an education disbursement administrator, with an address that changed 3 times and ended up at a strip mall in Kokomo. The annual accountings to the grantor stopped after 2009. In their place, beginning in 2010, the file contained a signed waiver of accounting, purportedly executed by Lucille M. Oakes, in that same forward slanting cursive with the looped capitals, notarized. Notarized. That was the word Marsden's eye stopped on, at 9:40 on a Sunday night, with his coat still on. Because a notary is not a rubber stamp. A notary in the state of Indiana keeps a journal. The journal records the date, the document, the name of the signer, and how the signer's identity was verified. And a notary's commission is a public record, filed with the Secretary of State, with a name and an address and a bond. The notary on the waiver was Katrina S. Strayhorn, commission number and everything, commissioned in June of 2010, at the age of 20. Marsden sat back in the folding chair. 2010, 3 years before the shower valve. 3 years before the hardware store, before the coffee, before the first date at the Mexican place on the state road, before all of it. His wife had been forging his grandmother's signature and notarizing it herself for 3 years before she ever spoke to him. Rustin Kessinger said, very quietly, "Man, do you need a minute?" Marsden said, "No. Scan the next one." They scanned until 2 in the morning. 416 pages. Yasmin Cortez practiced fiduciary litigation out of a second-floor office in Indianapolis, with a view of a parking garage and a wall of black binders. She had been recommended by exactly one person, a probate attorney in Lafayette who told Marsden, "She's expensive and she doesn't do feelings, and she has never once in her life lost a case involving a corporate trustee, because banks settle." Marsden brought her a 3-ring binder. He had made it himself, over 5 nights, with tabs. Tab 1 was the trust instrument. Tab 2 was his grandmother's arithmetic in pencil and the closing statement on the building. Tab 3 was his complete student loan history. Tab 4 was the post office box application and the forwarding instruction. Tab 5 was 62 forged disbursement requests in chronological order with a summary sheet he had made on the front, columns for date, amount, stated purpose, and payee, with a running total at the bottom. Tab 6 was the waivers of accounting. Tab 7 was the Secretary of State's public record for notary commission number and the name attached to it. Yasmin Cortez read for 50 minutes without saying anything. Then she closed the binder and looked at him. "Mr. Oakes," she said, "who else has seen this?" "An old woman who kept the film," he said. "Her grandson who scanned it. My grandmother, some of it. Nobody else. Does your wife know you have it?" "No." "Good," she said. "Keep it that way. And I need you to understand something clearly. You have been thinking of this as a family situation. It is not a family situation. A family situation is when your brother-in-law borrows $4,000. This is a fiduciary crime committed by a licensed trust officer against a minor beneficiary, and then maintained by a second person for 15 years. And every single one of those 62 documents is a separate felony. You are not going to be negotiating with anybody at a dinner table. You are going to be handing this to the state." She turned to the summary sheet. She said, "You've totaled the disbursements at $218,000. Yes, that's not the number." She took the cap off a pen. "The number is the corpus at termination. Your trust should have paid you out at 30. She did the arithmetic on the back of the sheet, the way people do who have done it 1,000 times. At the allocation your grandmother specified, over 13 years, with what happened in the markets. 268, roughly, at the low end, plus statutory interest from the date of termination. Plus, in this state, when a fiduciary self-deals, you can go after the profits of the self-dealing, not just the principal." She wrote a number and turned it around. Marsden looked at it for a while. Then he said the first genuinely unguarded thing he had said to anybody in 6 weeks. "I ate Thanksgiving at her house." "I know," said Yasmin Cortez. "Now let's talk about what the money bought." What the money bought took Marsden and a forensic accountant 6 weeks to lay out, and when it was laid out, it was almost unbearably ordinary. Quion Administrative Services LLC had been organized in 2007, 3 weeks before the trust was funded, by a certified public accountant named Dashiell Fournier. It had one bank account. Money came into it from exactly 4 sources over 18 years, and Marsden's trust was the biggest, but it was not the only one. There were 3 other names: Roxanne Nakashima, 88, of Sparrow Bend, who had funded a trust at Petersham in 2005 for her grandchildren, and who had died in 2019 believing it was intact. Her son Glenn had been told at the time that the account had been depleted by long-term care expenses, which had sounded plausible because she had been in a facility for 4 years. A man named Roland Pell, who had died in 2012, whose small trust for a disabled nephew had simply evaporated, and a 4th account that had been opened and closed inside of 2 years in 2011, which Yasmin Cortez looked at for a long time and said she was practicing on someone. Money went out of Quion in a pattern that a forensic accountant described in her report, in the flat language those reports use, as consistent with lifestyle absorption. The house on Sparrow Lake, purchased in 2011, with a $210,000 down payment that had come out of Quion in 4 transfers over 9 weeks. The startup capital for Strayhorn Tent and Event in 2014, $140,000, characterized on the company's books as a loan from an investor. 2 vehicles, a boat, 11 years of a payment to Fournier and Associates, $22,000 a year, coded as administrative services, which Yasmin looked at and said, "That's not an accountant's fee. That's a salary for a man who keeps his mouth shut." And $47,000, over 11 years, in payments to a private school in Carmel, for tuition. Marsden asked whose. Nobody's, as it turned out. The school had no record of a student. The payments had been reversed into a personal account within days each time, and the school line was cover for a routing that had gotten sloppy in 2013 and had never been cleaned up. He had been paying, out of a fund his grandmother built by selling his grandfather's shop, for the down payment on the house where his birthday dinner was held every September. 10 years of birthday dinners, in a dining room his grandfather's building had bought. He did not tell anybody how long he sat with that. Not Yasmin, not Vesta, not his grandmother. He drove out to the Vernon Street building on a Wednesday in November and parked across from it and looked at the bakery that was in it now, and the sign, and the little bit of the old painted lettering that still showed through the paint above the door if the light was right, Oakes scale. And then he went back to work and calibrated a set of platform scales at a recycling yard in Peru, Indiana. The affair he found by accident, which is how these things usually go. He was not looking for it. He had never once suspected it, and he would say later that this was the part that made him angriest at himself, because a man who prides himself on measurement should notice when a variable has been moving for 6 years. What he was actually looking for was a signature exemplar. Yasmin needed authentic samples of Katrina's handwriting from around 2010 to hand to a questioned document examiner. So on a Saturday, when his wife was in Chicago with her mother for a bridal show, Marsden went into the crawl space over the garage and brought down 4 plastic tubs of her old things, because she was a person who kept everything from before and almost nothing from after. He found her college notebooks. He found the exemplars. He also found, in the bottom of the 3rd tub, in a shoebox with ticket stubs and a dried corsage, a stack of birthday cards, his grandmother's handwriting on the envelopes, Larkspur Street return address, addressed to him, 9 of them, unopened, 1 a year, 2016 through 2024. He sat down on the plywood in the crawl space and opened them in order, and they were exactly what you would expect. A school teacher's cards, a few lines each, love from Gran, a folded $20 bill in 3 of them. And in the 2020 card, the year he turned 30, the year the trust was supposed to pay out, 4 sentences. Marsden, I hope the bank has taken care of everything and that you and Katrina can put it toward a house. Your grandfather would say, don't spend it on a car. I have been so proud of you every day since you were 11. Call me when you get this. He had never gotten it. He had never called. He had turned 30 and paid for his own dinner, and thought his grandmother had forgotten his birthday for the first time in his life, and he had never once mentioned it to her, because he did not want to make an 80-year-old woman feel bad, and she had never mentioned it either, because she thought he had gotten $268,000 and had not called to say thank you. For 5 years, each of them had quietly forgiven the other for something that never happened. That was the moment, not the forgeries, not the number on the back of the summary sheet. Marsden Oakes sat in a crawl space over his own garage, with 9 intercepted birthday cards on his knees, and understood that the theft had not been about money at all, in the end. The money was just what they took. What they had actually done was stand between an 84-year-old woman and the only family she had left for 9 years, and manage it. Underneath the cards, at the bottom of the shoebox, were letters in a different hand, 40 or 50 of them, printed emails, folded in thirds, going back to 2019. Some of them were from an address at Fournier & Associates. Marsden read 4 of them and stopped. He photographed the whole stack without reading the rest, put everything back exactly as he had found it, took the notebooks he had come for, and went down the ladder. He told Yasmin Cortez about it on Monday. She said, "Do you want to know what I think?" And Marsden said, "No." And then, after a moment, "Yes. I think," she said, "that the affair is 6 years old and completely irrelevant to your case, and that I will use it anyway, because the man is a signatory on Quion, and his testimony is worth more if he thinks he's protecting her, and less if he thinks she's protecting him. Divorce lawyers use affairs to get sympathy. I use them to split people." She wrote something on a pad. "And Mr. Oakes, when this becomes real to them, they will not come at you. That's not how these people fight. They will come at your grandmother." He asked her what she meant. She said, "She's 84. She's the only living witness to the funding of that trust, and she's the only person who can testify to what Delilah Strayhorn said in that office in 2007. If she is a credible 84-year-old, they lose everything. If she is a confused 84-year-old, they have a defense. They will try to make her confused." 2 weeks before Christmas, Katrina came home and said her mother was worried about Gran, and that Gran had called her twice about the same thing, and had she seemed off to him lately. Marsden said they hadn't noticed anything. In January, Delilah started dropping by Larkspur Street, twice a week, with soup. She had never once dropped by Larkspur Street in 10 years. In February, a woman from a home care agency called Marsden's cell phone to confirm an assessment appointment for Lucille Oakes that Marsden had not scheduled. When he asked who had scheduled it, the woman said, "A family member," and then, when he pressed, read out Katrina's number. And on the 4th of March, a process server came up the walk at Larkspur Street and handed Lucille Oakes a petition for the appointment of a guardian, filed in the Circuit Court of Sparrow Bend County, alleging that Lucille M. Oakes, age 84, was an incapacitated person, unable to manage her property or provide self-care, and requesting the appointment of a guardian of the person and of the estate. The petitioner was her grandson's wife. Marsden read the petition standing on his grandmother's front walk with his coat open in 29 degrees. It was 11 pages, and it was very well made. It alleged that Lucille Oakes had become confused about historical financial matters and had made repeated false statements about money at family gatherings, causing distress. It alleged that she had failed to maintain her home. It alleged that she had been the subject of concern by family members over a period of 18 months, and it attached a letter from a physician she had seen exactly once, in December, at an appointment that Delilah Strayhorn had driven her to and had sat in on. Lucille stood in the doorway in her cardigan with the pearl buttons, holding the storm door open, and she said, "Marsden, what is it?" And Marsden Oakes, who had said almost nothing for 5.5 months, made a decision that he would later describe as the only genuinely brave thing he did in the entire 11 months. He told her the truth, all of it. On the couch, for 2 hours, with the folder open on the coffee table. He had been protecting her from it. He understood, halfway through, that protecting her from it was the exact same instinct that had let the whole thing run for 18 years, and that everybody in this story who had gotten hurt inside a silence that somebody thought was kindness. When he finished, Lucille Oakes sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the coffee table for a long moment. Then she said, 9 cards. 9, he said. She nodded slowly. She said, "I want you to understand something, and I want you to hear me say it once. I was not confused. I signed 11 pages. I read all 11. I made a good decision in a bad year, and a professional woman with a lamp on her desk took it away from me and let me spend 18 years believing I had done right by you." She looked up. "Now, what does your lawyer need me to do?" Yasmin Cortez did not fight the guardianship petition. That was the part Marsden did not understand for about 10 minutes, and then understood completely, because it was the oldest move in his own trade. When somebody tells you the scale is fine, you do not argue. You let them put the load on it. "We are not going to move to dismiss," Yasmin said. "A dismissal ends it quietly on paper. We are going to let them walk your grandmother into a courtroom and put her competence at issue in a public proceeding, with a court reporter, under oath, and then we are going to let her answer questions. They have chosen the one venue where an 84-year-old retired chemistry teacher with a perfect memory is the strongest person in the room." She tapped the physician's letter. "And they have signed their names to a document, alleging that the true statements she made at that dinner table were symptoms." The hearing was set for the 22nd of April, in front of Judge Constance Ballard, which gave them 7 weeks. Marsden spent them the way he spent every audit. Amory Strayhorn broke on a Tuesday in a parking lot behind a hardware store. Marsden had thought carefully about how to do it. He did not ambush him. He called him, asked him to look at a set of scales for a job, and then in the parking lot he handed his brother-in-law a single sheet of paper, 1 page. The wire transfer schedule for $140,000 into Strayhorn Tent and Event in 2014, and next to it, the disbursement requests from the Oakes Educational Trust that had funded it, dated within 11 days of each transfer. Amory looked at it for a long time. He was 39 years old, and he ran a company with 14 employees and 1,100 folding chairs, and he had spent a decade telling a story at that dinner table about how he had built it out of nothing, with a truck and a nail gun. He said, "I asked her where it came from. What did she say?" He said, "She said it was Dad's insurance." Then Amory Strayhorn sat down on the curb behind a hardware store in his work jacket and put his hands over his face, and Marsden stood there and let him, because there was nothing to say, and because he needed the man beside him and not against him, and because, honestly, in that moment he felt sorrier for Amory than he had felt for himself in 6 months. Amory gave a sworn statement 11 days later. He gave the company's books. He gave 4 text messages from his mother from 2014, and he asked one question, at the end of the deposition, off the record, which was whether Marsden thought his sister had known. Marsden told him the truth about the notary commission from 2010. Amory did not speak again for a while. Merrill Redfern was 68 and lived in a condominium in Fort Myers half the year. He had been the branch manager at Petersham Savings and Trust from 1998 to 2016, and he was the second signature on 19 of the 62 disbursement requests. And when the investigator from the Indiana Attorney General's office called him, he retained counsel within 4 hours. The investigator was named Charlotte Rutherford. She had spent 11 years in the financial exploitation unit, and she had a specific, unglamorous specialty, which was elderly grantors and minor beneficiaries, the 2 categories of people in American finance who are least likely to ever look at a statement. She had taken Marsden's binder the way a machinist takes a part, turning it over, saying almost nothing. Then she had said, "Mr. Oakes, I get about 200 referrals a year. I get maybe 4 that arrive organized. Where did you learn to document like this?" He said, "I write calibration certificates." She said, "Well, that's what this is." Merrill Redfern cooperated in exchange for consideration. What he gave them was the thing no document could give them, which was the room. He described a trust department that was 1 woman and a part-time assistant. He described a bank where the dual signature requirement on fiduciary disbursements had been, in practice, a stack of forms brought to his desk at 4:40 on Fridays. He described being told, in 2009, that the Oakes boy's grandmother had asked for administrative handling because the boy was immature with money. And he described a conversation in the parking lot in 2016 after Meridian announced the acquisition, in which Delilah Strayhorn had told him she was taking early retirement and had said, and Redfern remembered it exactly because it had struck him as a strange thing to say, that some accounts were better off going quiet. Vesta Kessinger swore an affidavit about 11 cartons in a garage. Rustin Kessinger swore one about a scanner. The question document examiner, a woman in Chicago who charged $440 an hour, compared 62 signatures against Katrina Strayhorn's college notebooks and Lucille Oakes's authentic signature, and produced a report whose conclusions section used the phrase highest degree of confidence 11 times. And Marsden Oakes went to work every day and came home and ate dinner across from his wife and said nothing. She asked him, in April, a week before the hearing, whether he was going to be there. He said, "Of course, she's my grandmother." Katrina put her hand over his on the table and said, "I know this is awful. I want you to know I'm doing this because I love her." And Marsden Oakes looked at his wife of 10 years and said, "I know exactly why you're doing it." She smiled at him and went to bed, and he sat in the kitchen until 1 in the morning, because it had finally happened, the thing he had been afraid of for 5 months. He had said something true, and it had gone right past her, because she had never once, in 12 years, considered the possibility that he was measuring anything. The courtroom in Sparrow Bend County holds about 60 people. On the 22nd of April, there were 31 in it. The petitioner's side had brought 4. Katrina in a navy dress, Delilah Strayhorn beside her, Dashiell Fournier 2 rows back, which Yasmin Cortez noticed and wrote down, and their attorney, a good one from Indianapolis, who had been given a very tidy file by his clients, and who would, within about 90 minutes, understand that he had been lied to by the people paying him. Lucille Oakes took the stand at 9:50 in the morning in the cardigan with the pearl buttons. She was asked her name, her age, and her address. She gave them. She was asked the date, and she gave it. And then she said, "And it's a Tuesday," and the courtroom made a small sound. The petitioner's attorney went about it competently. He asked about the house. She described exactly which gutter needed replacing and the estimate she had gotten for it, $580, from a man named Tolliver. He asked about her medications. She named 4, with dosages and times. He asked about the dinner in September, and about her statement regarding a college fund, and he asked her, gently, whether it was possible she had confused it with something else. Lucille Oakes said, "No, sir." He asked if she was certain, and Lucille Oakes said, "Young man, I taught chemistry in this county for 31 years. On the 11th of April 2007, I signed an 11-page trust instrument in an office on the square with a green awning. I funded it with $170,000, $118 from the sale of my husband's building on Vernon Street, $41,000 from his railroad pension, and $11,000 of my own. I would be happy to tell you what the weather was." Then Yasmin Cortez stood up for cross-examination and asked Lucille Oakes 8 questions. The 8th one was, "Mrs. Oakes, do you recognize the woman seated at the petitioner's table, second from the left?" "Yes," said Lucille. "That's the trust officer." The rest of it took 4 minutes, and it was not really a hearing anymore. Yasmin Cortez moved to admit, as bearing directly on the petitioner's motive, a certified copy of a notary commission issued in June of 2010 to Katrina S. Strayhorn, and 11 waivers of accounting bearing Lucille Oakes's forged signature notarized under that commission, and 4 of the 62 disbursement requests. The petitioner's attorney asked for a recess and did not come back to the table. He went out into the hallway with his clients and did not lower his voice enough. Judge Constance Ballard denied the petition from the bench. She used the phrase "without merit," and then she used a longer phrase, which was that the court found the petition to have been filed for the purpose of impeaching a witness to a financial matter, and that she was referring the entire matter to the prosecuting attorney and to the Attorney General's office that same day. Then she looked over her glasses at Lucille Oakes and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. You should not have had to do that." And Lucille said, "It's all right. I've had worse Tuesdays." Delilah Strayhorn was arrested 11 days later, at 4:15 in the afternoon, at the Strayhorn Tent and Event Warehouse on Industrial Drive, under a tent her son had bought with money stolen from her son-in-law, which had been erected in the lot that morning for a client walkthrough. Marsden was not there. He was in Peru, Indiana, calibrating a set of scales at a recycling yard, and he found out about it from a text message from Amory that said, 4 words, "They just took her." Katrina was charged the same afternoon. Dashiell Fournier surrendered the following Monday. The charges ran to 31 counts against Delilah Strayhorn, including corrupt business influence, theft by a fiduciary, forgery, and financial exploitation of an endangered adult, which is the count that carries the most weight in Indiana, and which applied because of Roxanne Nakashima, 88, who had died in 2019, believing her grandchildren's money was safe. Delilah Strayhorn was sentenced, after a plea entered on the courthouse steps of a trial she was never going to win, to 16 years, with 4 suspended. Katrina Strayhorn was sentenced to 6 years for forgery and for her role in the guardianship petition, and surrendered her notary commission, and had her deposition read aloud at Fournier's sentencing. Dashiell Fournier lost his license, took 5 years, and paid $410,000 in restitution because he was the only one with anything liquid left. The house on Sparrow Lake sold in the spring for $541,000, and the proceeds were divided among 4 families under a constructive trust, which is a legal instrument that says, in effect, that a thing bought with stolen money was never really yours. Glenn Nakashima called Marsden the day the checks went out and could not finish a sentence for a while, and the total recovery on the Oakes Educational Trust, including principal, statutory interest, disgorged profits from the self-dealing, and the bank's own settlement for failing to supervise a trust officer for 18 years, came to just under $900,000. Marsden Oakes paid off $63,000 in student loans on a Thursday morning in October, from a laptop at his grandmother's kitchen table, at the table with the scorch mark, while she made eggs. Then he bought a building. The bakery on Vernon Street had been for sale for 2 years. He paid $194,000 for it, which was more than it was worth, and he spent 8 months on it, and in June he had a sign painter come out and do the front window by hand because his grandfather had hated vinyl. Oakes Scale and Standard, established 1961. Lucille Oakes cut the ribbon in August at 85 years old, in the cardigan with the pearl buttons, with a pair of shop scissors, in front of about 90 people, including a 75-year-old retired records clerk who was made to stand at the front and hated every second of it, and her grandson with the scanner, and Amory Strayhorn, who had come and who had not been sure he would be welcome, and who was. Inside, on a shelf behind the counter, under a glass bell, Marsden keeps a 1-kilogram stainless steel test weight. It is not the state standard. It is a working weight, certified, traceable, the kind of thing every calibration shop in America has 3 of. People ask about it because of the glass. He tells them it is there to remind him that nothing on earth measures itself. It's Marsden again. People ask me if I feel stupid. 18 years, a woman in my kitchen, and I never checked. And the honest answer is that for about a month I felt like the dumbest man in Indiana, and then I got over it, because feeling stupid is just pride wearing a work shirt. Here's what's actually true. Nobody in this story failed because they were foolish. My grandmother didn't fail. She did everything right. She hired a professional. She read all 11 pages, and she assumed that a system with a fiduciary duty in it would tell her if something went wrong. That assumption is the whole. Systems do not tell you. Systems wait to be asked. The thing that beat them, in the end, wasn't rage. I never raised my voice once in 11 months. What beat them was a habit from a trade almost nobody thinks about, which is that you never accept a reading from an instrument that hasn't been checked against something outside itself. Not your bank, not your spouse, not your own memory. Something outside. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to do tonight, and it takes about 4 minutes. Go to your state's unclaimed property website, the official one that ends in .gov, and search your own name. Then search your parents' names, and your grandparents' names, including the ones who have died. It's free. There is no catch. Billions of dollars sit in those databases because somebody set money aside for somebody else, and the paperwork went quiet. And if you know for a fact that a trust or a custodial account was ever set up for you, ask the trustee, in writing, for an accounting. You are entitled to one. You do not need a lawyer to ask. You do not need a reason, and you do not need anyone's permission. Ask while the people who love you are still around to remember the date.